origines sont en panique. J'ai fouillé dans toutes les poches du monde, y'a que du trafic. Pas facile, mon cœur a suivi sa logique. Il faut se mélanger.
On the 2006 track On Noir et Blanc, the Senegalese-French rapper Sefyu begins with the sound of West African shaker moving back and forth through the stereo field, its dotted rhythm emulating a heartbeat. Next, a needle is suddenly dropped on an old record. The scratch completes the pendulum's anticipated swing to the left, and then sweeps back to the right in the stereo field, obscuring the concluding shaker voice and briefly suspending the musical flow. Now, a distant-sounding piano emerges from the scratchy needle, playing a dirge-like minor key loop. The voice of Nina Simone enters on a single but splintered and echoing phoneme that seems to speak when. The note-against-note piano loop continues, establishing a static but now blues-inflected D minor harmonic environment. Again, the voice asks, when? The three distinct piano voices continue to wind to and fro in the repeating loop, moving independently but bound together in homophony by the rules of Western tonal harmony, of quote-unquote common practice. Finally, a diffuse bass bomb falls in pitch space, and just after the third beat of the loop, we hear a new phoneme that seems to make a request. Call. Sefyu's dry baritone enters this musical and rhetorical space as the bomb transforms into a bouncing bass line, doubling the inner voice of the piano line 2 octaves below, and further underscoring the lament's feeling of dissent. String tremolos underscore the tension of the MC's panic as the ghostly and hymn-like piano lingers in the rafters.
Mes origines sont en panique. J'ai fouillé dans toutes les poches du monde, y'a que du trafic. Pas facile, mon cœur a suivi sa logique. Il faut se mélanger dans la mixité, y'a rien de tragique. Pas facile, dans la vie y'a tout de pratique. Moi je dis que rien n'est magique et puis le racisme fatigue. Pas facile, de freine à fleurir mes registres. Même si t'es enfermé, que tu te sens seul, dis-toi que t'existes. Pas facile.
In 17 seconds, the opening sonic tableau establishes the themes of movement, dialogue, and mixture that set the sonic stage for Sefyu's meditation on France's nostalgia for simpler, purer, black and white times. In this chapter, I reimagine Edward Said's polyphonic model of contrapuntal analysis, stressing how his method provides a useful frame to analyze the interrelation of colonizer and colonized that we can hear resonating in post-colonial hip-hop. Moving beyond comparative approaches, contrapuntal analysis illuminates the dialectics of post-colonial culture. Said explains, quote, "The point is that contrapuntal reading must take account of both processes, that of imperialism and that of resistance to it." But unlike Said's reading of the dichotomous, discrepant experiences of imperialism, Sefyu's indictment of black and white thinking as a form of colonial nostalgia asks us to admit that voice-against-voice polyphony, so-called first species counterpoint, fails to fully account for the imminent mixture of post-colonial culture. Indeed, Said admits as much in the final paragraph of Culture and Imperialism, where he concludes, quote, "No one today is purely one thing. Labels like Indian or woman or Muslim or American are not more than starting points, which, if followed into actual experience for only a moment, are quickly left behind. Imperialism consolidated the mixture of cultures and identities on a global scale, but its worst and most paradoxical gift was to allow people to believe that they were only, mainly, exclusively, white or black or Western or Oriental." As we'll see, it is this paradox that Sefyu seeks to critique as colonial nostalgia for black and white. Sefyu's musical gestures to Africa, Europe, and America on noir et blanc establish a multivalent and unstable call and response that spans both continents and centuries. Yet the track is also anchored in a coherent logic born of the idea of black music and anchored in its particular history. The sounds of Black Atlantic traffic will ultimately be our focus, But for now, Miss Simone has focused our attention on another body of water, a deep river whose archive Sefyu has just accessed, the Mississippi. It turns out that the Nina Simone loop is comprised of samples from the 1962 album Nina Simone Sings Ellington. The song is Hey Buddy Bolden, a call into the past to find the legendary figure who Ted Gioia calls the elusive father of jazz. Indeed, the song is from Duke Ellington's 1956 musical allegory, A Drum is a Woman, which narrates the ways that African rhythm traveled, blended with other musical cultures in the New World, and ultimately gave birth to jazz. The first lyrical clip in Sefyu's reformulation of the song comes from the climax of the piece, wherein Simone relates the legend of Bolden's wide-open trumpet playing. The electronically manipulated when, that's so fractured and difficult to discern on the Sefyu track, rings clear as a bell in Simone's rendering.
Buddy Bolden tuning up, blowing horn was his game. Born with a silver trumpet in his mouth. Played the horn before he taught. Born on the afterbeat. He patted his foot before he walked. When Buddy Bolden tuned up, you could hear him clean across the river. Across the river, he woke up the working people and kept easy living. Call him Buddy Bolden, call him Buddy Bolden. Watch him, he's calling his flock now. He's calling his flock now. Here they come.
Thus, Sefyu's hip-hop examination of mixité goes to the well of New Orleans circa 1900. Using Simone's voice to access an historic when, his track engages an iconic city that stands as an enduring symbol of creolization. By going to this well, through the musical contours of contemporary hip-hop, and by sampling Simone's civil rights era call, Sefyu accesses an African-American archive and further layers the track's texture, both lyrically and rhetorically. Dipping even deeper, we find that Bolden's New Orleans is something of a portal to a yet earlier colonial archive, an especially rich symbolic site for the Black Parisian, Sefyu. Indeed, adjacent to the city's French Quarter is the legendary Place Congo, a public space once occupied by the sounds of African music on Sunday afternoons. When the first African slaves were brought to the Virginia colony in 1619, we might rightly understand their music to have been African. Over the course of almost 3 centuries, however, creolizing cultural processes moved apace, even as the colonial period gave way to the nationalizing efforts that legally encoded racial difference into the American blueprint. The national became the post-colonial in the United States. To explain what I mean by the post-colonial in this case, let me simply refer to the ways that colonialism's core machinations of racial subjugation and commercial exploitation continue to resonate today. To understand this enduring reality, we need look no further than Buddy Bolden's contemporary, W.E.B. Du Bois, who in 1903 described his experience of postcoloniality thus, quote, "One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, 2 souls, 2 thoughts, 2 unreconciled strivings, 2 warring ideals in one dark body." This, of course, is Du Bois's concept of double consciousness, And this is where we can begin to build an understanding of hip-hop as post-colonial art and practice. Before we go on, let me be clear about one thing. There's nothing fundamentally exceptional about the American experience of post-coloniality. All colonizing nations built their nations, and therefore their senses of nationality, on the backs of their colonies. All colonial relationships encoded forms of difference in their relational logics of subjugation and exploitation. What is remarkable and unique is the way in which the post-colonial experience in America gained musical form in the contours of African American expressive culture in the colonial period, gained commodity form over the course of the 19th century, and ultimately gained a wider audience than any other music in history. Indeed, the colonized are at the core of national identities in very real ways. As Ralph Ellison famously wrote in Time magazine, quote, "This is tricky magic. Despite his racial difference and social status, something indisputably American about Negroes not only raised doubts about the white man's value system, but aroused the troubling suspicion that whatever else the true American is, he's also somehow black. This is most abundantly clear in the world of black music, as Sefyu knows. Black music centers African American culture and American culture. By focusing on human traffic, dialogue, and mixture on the track, Sefyu interpolates himself into Ellison's formula while diversifying its antinomial racial national logic. On the track, he thus posits the transitive extension: whatever else the true Frenchman is, he is also somehow Senegalese, Algerian, Lebanese, Vietnamese, Martinican, Polynesian, and so on. This is indeed tricky magic. Sefyu's Noir et Blanc catalogues these national antinomies through sonic, visual, and lyrical paradoxes. He enters the intro's musical rhetoric with a refrain beginning, "My origins are in panic." How can one's origins be in panic? Origins are stable. They are original. But Sefyu has already looked in every corner of the world for his origins and instead found that there's nothing but traffic and mixture. In the opening tableau, the steady heartbeat of his presumed West African origins are interrupted musically as he voyages sonically from Senegal to New Orleans to search out other routes. Once there, Sefyu turns to Simone via Ellington to locate Bolden's clarion call. But Bolden's story is also the stuff of legend in a very literal way. Despite the myriad accounts from early jazz musicians about Bolden's seminal role in the development of jazz, the trumpeter cannot be located in the recorded history of early jazz. He, too, moved on in the traffic of history, and to this day, Bolden remains a blaring historical absence at the genesis of jazz. Another quest for origins that yields absence. In the first verse, Sefyu focuses his critique on pseudo-scientific biologics, deploying the visceral imagery of semen and blood to work against racialized thinking and its irrational white magic of racial science and eugenics. He underscores this paradox with the ironic construction hemophiliac pleasure before concluding, "Amen, c'est amin, même sang." Notably, Sefyu's wordplay in this critique calls on science and religion to make a case against the biological fallacy of race, as if to say, thank God we're all just amino acids. On the second verse, Sefyu tracks how racial thinking is encoded in the central metaphor of color. The future is white as unspoiled snow, the darkness breeds murder, and black fades on white, making gray, as we learn of métisés neutralisés, who live between two worlds, archetypal tragic mulatto figures. From this gray background, Sefyu broadens the palette, dancing around the singular chansonnière Edith Piaf's La Vie en Rose. Sefyu rehearses the symbolic weight of color and shade. In the wordplay here, whiteness brings to red an innocent pink and privileged life of pleasure, while blackness conjures up connotations of blood and danger when mixed with red. It is here that Sefyu first implicates his fellow post-colonial subjects directly. And in the austere black and white video for the track, Sefyu walks through Paris and its ethnically diverse projects on the outskirts of the city. He looks in the mirror and sees a reflection of his diverse nation. Far from an original visual effect, the scene is a well-worn trope. But in the context of the track and its visual representation of a mixed France, the gesture has the desired effect. France is not what it thinks it is.
Mes origines sont en panique. J'ai fouillé dans toutes les poches du monde, y'a que du trafic. Bah vas-y, oh, mon cœur a suivi sa logique. Il faut se mélanger dans la mixité, y'a rien de tragique. Bah vas-y, oh, dans la vie y'a tout de pratique. Moi je dis que rien n'est magique et puis le racisme fatigue. Bah vas-y, oh, de freine à fleurir mes registres. Même si t'es enfermé, que tu te sens seul, dis-toi que t'existes. Bah vas-y.
In the final verse, Sefyu collapses the themes of science and color. With increasing urgency, he tells the story of an interracial couple, Youssef and Mélanie, whose love draws them close enough to withstand the rancor of white supremacists. By the end of the story, Youssef and Mélanie become pregnant, and their child is represented as a symbolic explosion of colors. The first triad, blue, white, red, refers to France, Sefyu's home. The second, green, yellow, red, is Senegal, the birth nation of Sefyu's parents. The third and fourth are racial ethnic categories, including the term beurre, which is slang for Arab, and verlan, a French inversional street language, wherein the phonemes of French words are flipped and reformulated. Indeed, in this context, the appearance of the verlan term beurre reminds us that the name Sefyu is itself verlan, for Youssef, Mélanie's lover, and the artist's given name, Youssef Soukouna. What's more, and this should give us some sense of how dense Sefyu's wordplay is, Mélanie is also verlan for l'ennemi, the enemy. As he clarifies, in sum, I vanquished the sword, overcome by the kiss. The final verse ends with the same concluding lines as the first verse. Amen, it's just amino acid, same blood. Here with the added implication that it, the child, is much more than a jumble of racialized colors. The verse concludes, nostalgia I see in black and white, before turning to the chorus, first sung and then spoken in a monotone, as Simone's voice and the piano accompaniment fade into the distance, and the needle is taken off the record. In the final chapter of Souls of Black Folk, of the Sorrow Songs, Du Bois tracks how we can hear the nation's mixité resonating in the hymn-like African-American spirituals, a body of music whose, quote, elements are both Negro and Caucasian, the first and sole American music, the most beautiful expression of human experience born this side the seas. The chapter is thus of the Sorrow Songs and of the body politic. Recalling Said's contrapuntal analysis, Du Bois's poetic conclusion asks us to imagine this music through the biologic of musical miscegenation, first species counterpoint. The binary black and white argument is, of course, of its time. Du Bois's rhetoric is deeply suffused with the blood and soil logics of racial thinking at the height of global nationalism and its sine qua non, colonialism. But his oration comes alive on the written and musically notated page, using those same racial logics to appeal to national pride and reinscribe the African American into the American. In the end, his goal is not to celebrate a mixed America, but to challenge the nation to live up to her ideals, wherein the very idea of a mixed black and white society would be illogical. A society wherein homophony might be a better metaphor for a national harmony, singing in the same voice, and the musical biologics of first species polyphony would resonate discordantly. In that same concluding chapter, Du Bois clarifies, quote, in these songs I have said the slave spoke to the world. As the musical and rhetorical mixité of Sefyu's En Noir et Blanc indicates, the world was and is listening. Indeed, the world has been calling back and going to the well of African American music for well over a century. Du Bois concludes the chapter with a transcription of the spiritual "Let us cheer the weary traveler," and adds his own final words about global traffic. Quote, "And the traveler girds himself and sets his face toward the morning and goes his way. Watch him. He's calling his flock now. Here they come."
Mes origines sont en panique. J'ai fouillé dans toutes les poches du monde, y'a que du trafic. Pas facile, oh, mon cœur a suivi sa logique. Il faut se mélanger dans la mixité, y'a rien de tragique. Pas facile.